Remember the old Kenner Stegosaurus? I thought that I did. But, thanks to the internet, I was able to discover that I was looking back with rose-colored glasses. If you looked up Derpy in the dictionary, you'd probably see the old Kenner Stegosaurus' face. Don't get me wrong, it was a pretty cool figure, and back in '93, I would have loved to have had this in my collection. Notably, this was one of the first Stegosaurus action figures that wasn't depicted as a sluggish tail dragger. That alone is pretty remarkable, but nostalgia had blinded me to certain details of this figure. I still think it's pretty great conceptually, but some of the execution isn't as great as I remembered it. Look, I love this figure, I'm not bashing it because I hate it. I'm just saying that dinosaur figures have come a long way since '93. And while some of those things that we loved growing up may not be as great as we remember them, that's no reason why we can't try to recreate them and capture some of that childhood nostalgia with today's figures. So today, I'm going to try to recapture some of that Kenner magic of the original Stegosaurus with the new Hammond Collection Stegosaurus from Mattel. The first thing we've got to do is base coat this guy with that sickly pale green color of the original Kenner Stegosaurus. I have two different bottles of paint, both labeled as spring green, from the same manufacturer. One of them is a vibrant, bright, energetic green. The other one? It's Kenner Stegosaurus green, and that's the one we're going to use. Now, fortunately, we don't have to base coat this entire figure with this pale green color. This repaint is inspired by the Kenner Stegosaurus. It's not a one-to-one recreation. Otherwise, it would only have two colors. And honestly, I'm taking more inspiration from the collector card that came with the Stegosaurus than I am the Stegosaurus itself. Remember Kenner collector cards? All dinosaur action figures should come with collectible cards. Anyways, we're basically just covering up the existing green as well as the plates with spring green, which I really ought to just relabel as Kenner Stegosaurus green. And because the glass eyes on the Stegosaurus admittedly don't suck, I'm going to go ahead and mask those off to protect them from any overspray. And then we can continue on with the base coating, which includes the tail. Once the Stegosaurus is thoroughly colored in a sickly green color, we can start in on the patterning. For the patterns, I'm using a combination of English ivy green and dark granite, which will give us roughly the same grayish green color as we find on the Kenner Stegosaurus' patterns. And because we don't want a lopsided dinosaur, we're going to do both sides. I'm making the patterns roughly the same size, shapes, and positions as the ones on the Kenner Stegosaurus. Roughly. But if it's not exact, I'm not going to be too torn up about that. When the big splotches have been applied, we're going to go in and apply a lot of little splotches, and see how evenly we can splotch this Stegosaurus. Now, it's been a while since I painted a Stegosaurus, and I could have saved myself a lot of trouble if I'd waited to do this part until after I'd put a wash on the Stegosaurus' plates. But alas, the plates on the Kenner Stegosaurus are one solid color, but on the collector card, they've got patterns, and personally I think that looks a lot cooler anyways. So that's what we're doing here. It's a shame that all of these patterns are going to be obscured later, and I'll have to redo them, but we'll get to that when we come to it. I feel like this is not the first time I've made this mistake with Stegosaurus plates. Maybe I should paint them more regularly. Once all of the plates have been thoroughly patterned, including on the tail, we're going to go in with a toothpick and add some much smaller speckles. It's a pretty big dinosaur, so this is a lot of speckling. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to give it an airbrushed coat of palm leaf. Again, this is based more on the collector card than the actual Kenner toy Stegosaurus. And that one has some brighter greens on it. That palm leaf overspray had the effect of dulling some of the patterns a little bit. So I'm going to add some pavement to my pattern mix and kind of go over some of those patterns a little bit now. I'm not filling them in completely. This is really just adding some darker tones into those patterns, which will give it a little bit more variation in color, like the Stegosaurus as it's depicted on the collector card. And we'll do that all the way down the length of the tail and on both sides of the dinosaur. In addition to that variation in color on the patterns, I want to add a little bit of variation to the color on the plates too. So I'm going to put some watered down yellow ochre between the patterns on the plates. And in the end, honestly, this is a step that I probably could have skipped. Not that the wash itself was ill-advised, just the order in which I did it. I should have done this before the patterns. The wash is that same pavement color that I used to fill in the patterns a little bit earlier. And this wash is going to seep into all of the recessed areas on those plates and bring out all of that detail. It's also unfortunately just going to obscure all of the patterning we did on those plates earlier. Once the wash is dried, we're going to go ahead and hit those plates with a dry brush. And that's going to highlight all of the raised detail. The Stegosaurus plates have a lot of surface area, and this is going to take a minute, so I'll just catch you in the next step. Once the plates have been thoroughly dry brushed, I'm going to go ahead and go in and reinforce all of those patterns that unfortunately got kind of obscured by the wash, and then almost completely erased by all of the dry brushing. There's an order of operations to these things, and if you neglect to do them, you make more work for yourself. Once we've recreated the pattern on all of these plates, we're going to go in with a very dry brush with some yellow ochre on it. And using that dry brush, I'm just going to lighten in the colors on the plates and thagomizers between all of the patterning, which will help to give the patterns a little bit more definition and just to give the plates a little bit more color, without making them crazy colorful. But we do still want this to be recognizable as the Kenner Stegosaurus, or rather recognizable as having been inspired by the Kenner Stegosaurus. Once all that yellow dry brushing has been applied, I'm going to load the same color that I used for the initial patterns in my airbrush, that greenish gray. And I'm going to go over the top of the Stegosaurus and drag some of that color lightly from the spine down towards the ventral areas. And that's just going to subdue all of the bright colors. The Kenner Stegosaurus is pretty subdued greens. We also want to make sure that we perform the same operation on the tail. It would be a damn shame if I plugged that tail in and it didn't match the rest of the figure. Okay, now that I'm happy with the application of all that subdued green, I'm going to go ahead and plug the tail in and make sure it matches. Yay, it matches. I really didn't want to redo all that. Well, we're getting to the home stretch. Now I'm going to dry brush some pale spring green all over the entire Stegosaurus. You know, that Kenner Stegosaurus green from earlier. And that'll help tie everything together even more, as well as bring out some of that raised detail. Well, it's looking pretty Stegosaurus-y, but I do think we're missing something here. That's right, another wash. Why another wash this late in the game? Well, because Stegosaurus should have dirty feet. After all, it does spend all day walking on them, so we'll just work all that mud in between the toes and under the fingernails. Once I've applied the wash proper to the feet and the lower part of the lower legs, I'm going to take a paintbrush that just has water on it and drag that wash up towards the rest of the legs. And that'll just kind of fade the wash in, make it a little bit less abrupt and more gradual. And we'll do this to both the forelimbs and the hind limbs. There we go, this is shaping up to be one fine looking Stegosaurus. Once that wash is dried, we're going to go ahead and paint the toenails. I'm using a combination of dark granite and pavement for the toenails. Now, I know that I said that we were on the home stretch a few minutes ago, and we are, but in addition to the toenails, the Stegosaurus also has a beak. I'm going to paint that in with some warm buff with just a hint of yellow ochre mixed into it. And it's small, so the paint goes on pretty quick. Once that paint dries, I'm going to hit it with a very faint burnt umber wash, because there's actually quite a bit of detail sculpted into this Stegosaurus's beak. If Mattel put as much effort into the small dinosaurs in the Hammond collection as they do the large dinosaurs, well, I would have had more positive than negative to say about them in my little 3-minute reviews. Which would have been great. I don't like being negative. Once the wash is dry, I'm going to go ahead and dry brush with that same warm buff yellow ochre mixture. Because again, quite a bit of detail on this tiny little beak. Once that beak is done, then the Stegosaurus is done. And with the Stegosaurus done, it is time for glamour shots.